Hello and welcome to the Wednesday Chthonia live stream. My name is Breach Burke. I am the host of the Chthonia podcast. And I'm starting to do these on Wednesdays now as much as it becomes possible because there is so much going on. And I know I talk every week about all the stuff that's going on when we are, that's been going on with Chthonia and also just going on with my business life, which is quite varied. I do a lot of teaching, and people might know that I've picked up another teaching job for the semester that starts half-term course that's going to start next month. So that's going to affect my time. And I usually give a little update on what's going on. The main thing I think I would like to mention to people today is the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth, the ISFM, is now accepting. Like I said, you can enroll there if you would like to join us for the spring 2025 semester, which has to do with masculine and feminine integration. That's the main theme. We are going to have all the same instructors back from last terms. And hey, Alex, how are you? Just saw the comment come up. So good to see you. Always good to see you. Always good to have people who are joining me. So yeah, we are going to that has actually been I've been putting the advertising out every week, trying to let people know on Instagram what classes are being offered. And Kathleen, hello, good to see you. So I'm going to, we have that kind of a theme. And in addition, this is different from last semester. We're also going to have Susie Graf, who is going to come and do a workshop on writing mythological characters. And Susie has a lot of experience. She's a NYU, she was a filmmaker. And while she's not, she tells me, well, I'm not doctor, but she does actually have a lot of experience in writing, like I said, writing, filmmaking, and she's had a number of associations. I know she's traveling right now, but and she is working on a book as well that I've done I've done some editorial work on it for her, but we have a lot of these things that are kind of going back and forth. So she's a very good person to talk about how one can potentially develop mythological characters. And again, this is a workshop that it's not one that I'm opening up to the public. It's going to be open to people who are enrolled in the full term. So, but everything else, if people want to say, okay, I just want to pay to audit that lecture. Also, if you're on Patreon, see if that's part of your benefits. I know that I allow to, usually I have like the mini course list, but people are also welcome to take ISFM classes if they want to as part of that benefit on Patreon. So that's something you can think about. So that's the main order of business. I'm preparing for a lot this week. I've got to spend tomorrow doing taxes, which is not going to be fun because when you have a very varied business, that gets to be very, very complicated. And I do it myself. I don't hire an accountant. So yeah. So anyway, we'll see how that goes tomorrow. Plus, I'm teaching 2 classes over the weekend in person in 2 different places. So yeah, a lot going on, very, very busy. Now, I just dropped the podcast on Lua Saturni. Okay, and this was, I used that particular name. Lua is sometimes known by other names, Lua Mater, Mother Lua, and also Lua. The Lua Saturni implies her as a consort of Saturn. You love what you're building. Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Shani. It's interesting that your name is Shani because one of the things I'm about to talk about today is actually the Hindu deity called Shani. Because in this week's podcast, we have the theme of it connected to Lua Saturni. Again, a deity who there's really not a whole lot of information about her, but there's still, Sam and I were having these conversations about Saturn and Saturnian practice and just different elements of both Etruscan and Roman mythology, which we both are very, very interested in. This kind of came out, a whole lot of associations came out with Lua Saturni. And in particular, the idea of her as being this kind of ineffable being who is secret. Like the image that I actually have, at least on one version, I think it's the YouTube version of this week's podcast, is that it shows the woman kind of doing this. Now, of course, one thing I did not mention in the podcast was that it is the name of Saturn in the language. Yes, you are correct. And it's, yeah, I feel like this is, So Louis Saturni has this connection to a lot of other deities, and the one whose image I have this week is the goddess called Angarona, and those who practice do different esoteric practices will certainly know about this sign, the sign of silence. And I have done podcasts before. I know I've done it on Patreon on the idea of the Thackeray, which is this to be silent. People talk about to know, to will, to dare, and to be silent. So this idea of silence that one has. And the idea of Louis Saturni as being kind of the silent figure, to me, almost suggests she's something akin to a Shakti, even though I realize that that is not a concept that we see in even sort of, well, I don't know. We don't necessarily see it in kind of what we think of as maybe Hellenistic beliefs or Roman beliefs. We don't see that idea per se. People always tend to think of that feminine consort as being a kind of, the feminine consort is like the wife. And if you look at the mythology of the Matrikas in India, they are all Shaktis, and they are not. Sometimes they're characterized as, oh, this is the spouse, like Indrani, for example, as the wife of Indra, but she's also a kind of Shakti in her own right. And certainly within the context of Hinduism, you will see that the Shaktis are the ones when there are these great battles. It's the Shaktis who actually go out and do the fighting rather than the male deities. And this actually tracks with what I want to just use that word track to think about what I wanted to talk about today, which is a little bit about what I mean by the dark masculine. Okay, we talk a lot about the dark feminine on this particular podcast, and we also, I think, if we're also going to talk about with the school this theme of masculine and feminine integration, I think taking a look at this aspect of the masculine, it's worth discussing. Now, the great irony is that when I talk about the dark masculine, I'm thinking more of it. Weirdly, it's almost the opposite. It's like the solar aspect that's almost too solar. It becomes something that becomes associated with this the idea of Sol Invictus, right? The whole unconquerable sun. This is the all powerful ruler in the name of the sun god. And the one who can be very harsh, authoritarian, and must be obeyed. So there's an element of that there. And I feel like it's that kind of solar active energy, which we might also equate with Mars to some degree, because there's like a martial element to it. There's a warlike element. The thing that says, like, I need to get the thing that I want. And if I don't get what I want, I will use force, weaponry, whatever to achieve it. Right? And interestingly, just before I came on to go live, one of the tasks I had in the morning was grading my papers. I have weekly, they're not really papers per se, but there's weekly assignments. And I'm really actually impressed with how good of a job students are doing without having to go to AI and things like that, discussing their own kind of ideas and experiences in the way that I want them to. And the topic that we had for this week had to do with myth and ritual. And one of the questions I asked them, as I said, what do you think the American social myth is? What would you consider to be a social myth? And people had different ideas, but a lot of people came up with what I think of as probably, at least for probably since the inception of the United States, the most preeminent myth, which is that of the American dream. Okay, and the American dream says what? It says, work hard and you will be rich. You will be rewarded. That was the reason that everybody came to America. Land of opportunity, which is another thing that has to do with that, right? Like, oh, you come there. I remember my grandparents and so forth. Like, I remember on my mother's side, they all believed that, well, I'm going to come to America and the streets are going to be paved with gold and there's going to be so much opportunity and so much money. And of course, none of that's actually true. In fact, generally, the people who make the most money are the people who are the most well-connected. Either they have it through their family or they manage to have certain, it all has to do with social status. A lot of it is the way that people have lots of money. I remember listening to a talk by Cory Booker where he referred to being born on third base. And it's that kind of a thing. It's not when people who say, well, I worked hard to have what I did. It's like, yes, after your father gave you a couple $1 million, yeah, you did great. Most of us don't have that thing. And some theft. Yes, you are correct. Yeah, that is definitely another component that they don't really talk about. And I said the irony is that the one time in American history, I guess you would say, where the American dream might have been very possible to some degree was in the 1950s. Now, mind you, when I say that, it was only really attainable still for certain people, and certain other groups were still very much excluded from that. But that was the time, ironically, when the wealthy were taxed at the 95th percentile. So in other words, if you were a millionaire, you had to pay your fair share of taxes. Ooh, what a concept. And if we still had that today, we'd probably be we'd be in great shape as a society if people paid their fair share. But we know that that doesn't. Speaking of theft, that doesn't really exactly occur. So, and now we're seeing certainly extremes of that. But anyway, I'm not gonna derail into politics. I promise you. But it does make me think about this masculine energy. So when we talk about the masculine, what are we talking about? Well, if we think about it in the sense of, if we go back to yin and yang, okay, which is not the only way to characterize masculine and feminine, but we might think of it as this yang energy that is active, that is hot, okay, hence the solar connection, right? And that it is rational, it is individualistic. It's the idea of, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality definitely comes out of that masculine thinking. It is a type of thinking that makes science the standard for truth, okay, where reasoned objective analysis is where we get to, to determine what is true. Philosophy is definitely a very masculine kind of an activity. So, that's just a few examples. We could come up with more. Now, by contrast, when we talk about the feminine in that context, if we're talking about more yin energy, we're talking about something dark, something has to do with cooler energy rather than warmer energy. Again, at least in this conception, there are other conceptions of the feminine, as we know, that are different from that. But having to do perhaps with nurturing, having to do with the collective, what's good for the community rather than just what's good for me. That's why I think a lot of time women in particular are always seen, I always talk about it like if I go into a restaurant by myself, it's almost like, oh, but you're not with someone. And I always say, well, do I need a babysitter? But really it comes to this idea that if you are feminine, that there's this idea that you exist as part of a system or part of a family, whereas the man can be the individual, right? So these are unconscious things that we project onto society. I'm not saying this is something everybody just accepts wholesale, but there does tend to be this idea of femininity as connected to community, to relationship, to and when to be passive, because there are times when it's not good to be active, And oh, hello, welcome back. So yeah, so when we talk about this idea of this masculine versus the feminine, this is kind of where we are with those ideas. It's not about specifically what men and women do, though what society may expect of masculine and feminine roles may be to a certain extent informed by those unconscious kinds of associations. Now, as I've mentioned many times in Hindu mythologies, it's the reverse. Shiva is often seen as passive, whereas the Shakti energy or Parvati energy is the active one. So that aspect of it is reversed. And the image that one can point to, the most specific image of this, because in a certain sense, they're both active in their own way, right? But the one image that we can look at is that of, we frequently see this image of goddess Kali, where she's kind of dancing in this burning landscape, with all the heads around her neck, holding her side, and she steps on the body of her husband, Shiva, laying in front of her. I don't have it out right now, but I do have a statue of that exact image, where Shiva lays down and his eyes are closed, almost like he's dead, and Kali steps on top of him. Now, this is the active feminine. This is the active feminine that's both creative and destructive. And the reason he lays down in front of her to be passive is to stop her from destroying the world. And that was something I was talking about with a student today. I said, Shiva Shakti energy, it's like they're both creative and destructive at the same time. And they represent that relationship between life and death. Like, you don't have one without the other. They're intricately bound up in this cycle. So, Yeah, so you have this idea of Shakti. So when I talk about Louis Saturni as potentially being the Shakti of Saturn, and I go into great depth into that in the podcast, but it did get into a little bit of a side discussion about Shani and who he is. Now, Shani is the Hindu name for Saturn. Okay, so now we think of it in Greek as being Kronos, although yes, there are definitely correspondences between Kronos and Saturn, but there are also some differences between the two of them. Because Saturn, just like Mars in Roman myth, tends to have a lot more to do with agriculture. So he tends to have a little bit more of an agricultural inflection in his way of being. And again, Roman myth, initially Romans never had a mythology. They adopted their mythology from, and people think from the Etruscans, but Etruscan does not always equal Roman. Okay, that's something that something that I think I was even taught in civilization, world civilization classes when I was growing up, social studies classes. That isn't always the case. As I've learned, Etruscan does not always equal Roman, but even the Etruscans have taken a lot of their mythology from the Greeks as well, which is something else people I don't think recognize. I mean, they do have some very unique myths and some very unique ideas about the afterlife, but they are, there's a lot was adopted from the Greek because a lot of Roman and Etruscan culture was more, I guess the term would be animistic. They believed that everything was alive. And I think the way it was characterized, I'm trying to remember if it was, no, it wasn't Livy. I think, it was Seneca the Younger. Seneca the Younger is the one who had said that the difference between the Etruscans and the Romans is that they said if lightning presents itself, then the Romans think that it's because clouds have, knocked together or something and created lightning, right? Or whatever explanation was going in the Roman Empire at that time. And he said the Etruscans will see it the other way around, that, it's almost like the clouds are there because the lightning has to occur. Like everything is a divine act in that way of thinking. And that was the way the Romans characterized it. And when they absorbed Etruscan culture into them, they said probably around 400 BCE, the Etruscans were very much, it was almost like, initially it was, if you were a Roman statesman, to say that you had an Etruscan heritage was sort of like akin to having this very noble ancestry. But after a while, they said they stopped speaking the Etruscan language, and you even had like writers and orators like Cicero who would ridicule the Etruscans, like, oh, the Etruscans and their silly beliefs, right? So eventually you see these things kind of getting absorbed, but mythologically, they both tend to come from the Greek and Roman. And so we tend to sometimes forget that the Romans, because of the background that they come from, their gods have a slightly different inflection to them. And there does tend to be a deeper connection to not only to public life, but to agriculture. The Romans were very much like a lot. There's certain cultures who are very, I'll use the word isolationist, and I don't know if that's exactly conveying what I want to convey. So in other words, it's like, okay, the Roman Senate would have decided what the gods were going to be. Initially, the Roman kings, and then later the Roman Senate would say, well, these are the only gods we're going to accept, and we're not going to let anybody in who worships these other gods. There was the famous incident with the Bacchanals in I can't remember. I don't remember if it's 186 or 185, 186-ish BCE, when there was apparently a Bacchanal taking place, worship of Dionysus worship come into Rome as worship of Bacchus. And when they came in, what ended up happening was there was a woman who went and said, oh, they're bringing the child in for this initiation ritual, and they're having orgies and doing horrible things. And by the way, the woman had never seen anything. It was really just a lot of hearsay. But Livy talks about this in the annals of Roman history. But the net result of that particular encounter was that not only were Bacchanals banned in Rome at that time, of course they did eventually come back, but also Jewish religion was excluded at that time, weirdly enough, and so was philosophy. All of those were excluded in kind of the same batch, and that's kind of its own weird side story there. But in that period of time, the point being is that the Roman Senate and the Roman government had the gods were very important, not only to the household, but to the community, the genius loci, or the genius romani, or Romi, really, is the idea of this kind of empowering spirit that is the life of the city and is the life of the community. So they were very protective of that, and they didn't want all these other. But then once they became an empire, then all bets are off. And we talked about that kind of with the Serapis episode. So okay, now what it was said was that Saturn was actually at one time, probably in archaic Roman history, that what we think of as the Palatine Hill in Rome, where the Capitolium is, where they had the triad of deities, usually Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. That there was an earlier triad. They called it the Archaic Triad, but also there was supposed to be a temple of Saturn. Supposedly, it was called Mount Saturnus, and that the Etruscans were known as Saturnia, that they were all connected to Saturn in this kind of a way. Now, again, this is what the ancient writers have said. There's some dispute as to whether or not that was true, but nonetheless, there was definitely the idea there was a gate of Saturn, and that Saturn as a deity was like the primary deity of Rome at one time, and due to his great importance, and that eventually, you start to see this start to go away. Now, I get into the whole electric universe theory, which I don't know, that might be a bit much to try to bring in here right now. But the electric universe theory is very interesting because one of the things that it postulates is that there was a period in Earth's history, like cosmological history, where the actual sun, the actual star that we experienced, or at least one of the stars, because the idea, some of them talk about the idea of two suns. You see this in the Sumerian writings where they talk about Saturn as the star of the sun. Okay. And the theory that has been postulated by electric universe theorists is that Saturn actually started out as a brown dwarf, that it was actually a star, and that gave off probably a reddish kind of a light, which is actually a very good light for growing things. Hence the reason Saturn is often associated with abundance, an abundance of growth. We forget that Saturn is associated, like Kronos, with the golden age. Okay. Saturn is that age where supposedly people were connected to the gods and the things were much more perfect, was supposedly connected to the time connected to Saturn, which, again, given the astrological associations we have with Saturn or with Shani in the Hindu, we might not think that. We might think that Shani is, or Saturn is something malevolent in some way, or evil, or at very least represents, first of all, representing the inevitability of time and death, right? Because he's always pictured with a scythe. But in Roman culture, he's pictured with a scythe because that scythe is to do the harvest, right? So, but he's also has to do with the sowing of seeds. And Lua, actually, as a deity, is one who could bring blight on the seeds. So it's interesting that she kind of has this destructive kind of aspect to her. But the secret thing about her is that she's supposed to be the secret, ineffable protector of Rome to some degree. And she's connected with other goddesses that are connected to that, because they also connect her with Ops, which is another goddess who is connected to grain and the harvest. She's always pictured holding like corn stalks or, different things. And her partner, Consus, who has to do with, Consus had come to have the association of secrecy. So when one has a consulate, right, the idea is that these are like a cabal of secret meetings, that Consus is associated with that takes place in secret, interestingly enough. So you have this whole idea of this kind of almost hidden kind of a factor there, and he was the spouse of Ops, who is sometimes conceived of as Lua as well. So there's a lot of interesting associations, because in that respect, Lua was like the secret protector of Rome, okay, and perhaps even of the Etruscans. I mean, I'm not totally sure whether that would have been the conception, but there was definitely the idea, and her name was not even allowed to be spoken because it could be damaging to, the idea that you speak the name, you give away power when you speak a name, right? So anyway, this was very interesting to me, because it shows us Saturn in a very, very different light, so to speak. And so, yeah, this electric universe theory that says that Saturn is basically the sun of the night sky. And now, if we go and look at outside at night and we see Saturn, I mean, yes, this was before telescopes, obviously, but you look at Saturn in the night sky, and like Jupiter, Saturn might be very, very bright. Okay, but you would not look at Saturn and think, oh yeah, that's the sun, right? Like that seems a bit excessive, you know. But the idea was that in the way the universe formed, that the Earth and Mars and the Moon all formed before like Venus, and I'm not quite sure where Jupiter fit into that mix, but that Saturn was close enough to be like a sun to us, sun, sun, in addition to the other sun. So there's this talk about two suns, or Saturn as being the star of the sun. And that was from writings from about cuneiform writings from about the 13th century BCE. So we're talking, the 12,000s BCE is where we're seeing this. This is probably more than 10,000 years before like the Trojan War. So again, it's hard to say exactly. It's an interesting theory. I don't know. They've talked about the science and mathematics behind it. Certainly, electric universe theory was developed by a Nobel laureate, so it wasn't just somebody's woke up with this idea. But at the same time, I feel like it's the things that the theory has against it. I don't know enough about those sciences to be able to say, oh well, this is good about it, or this is what's bad about it. That's something. I think it's thunderbolts.info is the website where they have all of this. Does that lead to the black sun concept, or is that something adjacent, is what Alex is asking. Oh, very good. You're getting towards the black sun. Yes. That very possibly could be the origin of that concept. And black sun has been used in a variety of different ways. And certainly that is one possibility for that concept. Because the idea of Saturn as the black sun is, people kind of say, well, where exactly does that come from? Now, in Hindu mythology, not in a scientific sense, but mythologically, is what Alex is saying. It could be. That's what we're trying to figure out. Is kind of like, does the science intersect with this? Was this something people actually experienced Saturn in that way? Therefore, seeing Saturn as this kind of night star, right? Because Saturn would be the sun that shone at night. Therefore, yes, the black sun, the sun of night. So yeah, that's where you would see that connect in. But whether that was simply a turn of phrase, or whether that was a literal thing that people experienced, that's the piece that we're not really sure about. Now, when you get back to Surya and Shani. Okay, so I don't know if I had the story quite right in the podcast, because I knew there was a connection between the two and that there was a contention, but I went back and I looked up the story just to see what it was. Now, what it is that Surya is actually the father of Shani in this particular version. That so that does portray Saturn as being a child of the sun, so therefore some kind of a star. But he's considered to be the outcast because, okay, Surya's wife is what was her name? It was Sanjana or Sanyana. I'm not quite sure whether there's the mark over the J or not for that. It creates a shadow double of herself called Chaya. And this is because the heat of her husband is so hot, she can't bear to be close to him. So she creates this shadow double to be like his partner, and, so that she can kind of get away. And with this Chaya, this shadow double, Surya mates with her and creates Shani, okay, who is Saturn. Now, because of this shadow union, Saturn ends up becoming an outcast. He ends up getting kind of cast out into the farther reaches of the universe, and he is the last of the grahas. Because sorry, starting to get dry throat here. He is the last of the grahas. In Vedic astrology, they talk about the 9 planets, and the 9 planets that they're talking about are the sun, the moon, Rahu and Ketu, which are the north and south nodes of the moon. And then they're talking about Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. That's it. They don't talk about Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, because that was certainly not, they were not conceived of as planets, certainly at the time that the Parahamsa, that the astrological writings were written. And people who follow traditional astrology, Vedic astrology, stop with Saturn. Now, I have seen more modern Vedic astrologers incorporate Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, whatever these other influences, but it's not usually part of traditional Vedic astrology. So this creates a contention. There's an enmity now between this kind of disowned sun, so to speak, sun S-O-N and sun S-U-N, right? Who's kind of left out in the outer reaches here. And so Shani is the one who tends to thwart, the kinds of things that who tends to be the one that makes them it's seen as negative. He gets associated with karmic justice. He's associated with with severity. Typically, when you go in, if you're in a Shani phase of life, frequently they'll ask you to say Shani Puja. And I've done Shani Puja before. It's definitely a kind of puja that can mitigate the effects of Saturn. But Saturn is also, they noted, portrayed as dark complexion, which weirdly, it's very strange almost to think about. But I talked about this in the Sodashi podcast that I had done on the Mahavidya called Sodashi. And the idea of darkness, of that dark, the dark half of things, they call it Krishna Paksha, right? This is the dark of the moon, or Shani as this dark deity. Then there becomes this perception of negativity. We see that with Kali too, even though I think it's understood within the culture that they're not negative per se, they end up having a more inauspicious kind of association. And Shani is definitely one that is like this, that is considered to be this kind of disenfranchised child of the sun. So when I start thinking about ideas of the dark masculine, okay, if we're going to kind of go back around to that theme, I think the idea of the solar deity who is the one who is visible and the one who is recognized, and this other sun that's kind of pushed out and rejected, and maybe I don't know if you want to consider Saturn to be a vengeful deity in this sense, but certainly the one who is going to potentially bring suffering or not make things easy. And perhaps there's a sense of betrayal there, of like, my gifts are not being acknowledged and recognized. So Shani has a lot to do with things that take time, okay, in that way of thinking. But what's interesting to me is that when I think of the dark masculine, there are a lot of people who embrace, let's just say, more fascist or more totalitarian ways of looking at things, who often embrace Saturn, almost like Saturn is their sun. But I think this is a misunderstanding of Saturn, to be honest with you. And that's why you will often have heard, like the Nazis, for example, would talk about this golden age. And this is what they would associate with. They commandeered all of that imagery. So if somebody has like a black sun image, which is often like this disc with the 12 of the runes of Soelu or Sig or Soelu around them. I learned the rune as being called Soelu, but it's the rune of the sun. It looks like the little jagged lightning bolt, and that's considered to be the 12 of them, co-opting a lot of the solar imagery, just like the swastika. I mean, that's a Hindu image. The swastika is a sun symbol. If you look at the St. Bridget's cross or the Breege cross in the Celtic, that's exactly the same thing. It's just, you've got the kind of equal armed kind of cross that represents the solar disk and the spinning of the sun, and also the cycle of time, because time is often, you generally have calendars that are either lunar or solar in their effect. And typically, if you are following a solar calendar, you're talking about a 12-month year. And there's a whole lot around the cult of the 12 and the importance of the number 12, from the Hittites to the 12 Olympians, on Mount Olympus. You've got 12 apostles of Jesus, 12 imams in Islam. You've got a lot of this idea around the 12, and that is definitely that solar day aspect of things. In fact, the word deus, which is the Latin word for God, implies something light or something having to do with daytime. Now, the thing is, okay, when it comes to these kinds of solar mythologies, if we think about the attributes of the sun, if you think about the attributes of Leo 9 energy, okay, it's now, again, like we've just said about the masculine, there can be some very positive inflections of that. Having reason and analysis and all this is good. Scientific observation, all good, all fine. The idea that you get organized, take responsibility for your things, put things into action, all of this is important. It's not that it isn't important. But like anything, it becomes a problem when it is cut off from the feminine. And this is literally the discussion I was having with my students, is that because they were pointing to ideas of progressivism and individualism, advances in technology since the Industrial Revolution, like our ideas about what it means to be perfect and our ideas about what is true have this very heavily masculine inflection. And I think probably the thing I was trying to say in the last podcast that when I was starting to talk about AI and stuff was that a lot of times the way that we model, like we think about it, like I think somebody was saying like, oh, well, DNA is a kind of coding and the body is kind of, has this, is made up of crystalline structure, different things, different elements and things that machines are also made up of. But remember, machines came second. So really the machines are kind of based more on us and not the other way around, at least in the way that they're conceived. But the way in which these very complex types of programming are meant to imitate human life, it gives you an idea, an insight into how emotions and things are understood in that technological context. And it takes a lot of the feminine out. Because even though, yes, there's been attempts to try to have AI imitate human emotion or, human compassion and things like that, it never quite does it in the way that they expect. Because we tend to think of that, if you tend to think of it as kind of a mechanistic programming, it is the piece that scientists have not really understood about humans, like what role all of that plays. But that's the piece that I say has to do more with the creative feminine. It has to do with, and again, remember, we're not talking about men and women. We're just talking about aspects and concepts. But it has to do with what's received, what's intuited, what's felt, what's experienced in a certain way, rather than just what's kind of analyzed and dissected. Okay, you need really both components to really be whole. And so when I think of the idea of dark masculinity, and again, I'm using that ironically in a way because it's not really truly dark. You might think of Chthonia as being kind of the dark masculine, but really he's more of this shadow side. He represents this kind of shadowy element, and the kind of negative reputation he has may not be entirely earned, because when you start thinking about the sun, like I said, in the way that you see in fascist governments, or the way that you would see in Rome when you started to have emperor worship and things like that. And these were ideas that kind of got mixed in with Christianity, which initially, the Christianity that we have now is not, or what we think of as the institutions, church institutions and things. They've become kind of wrapped up in this idea. Okay, wrapped up in this Jesus as Sol Invictus idea. Unconsciously, that's part of it. Christ is the conqueror and the king and the one who who fights off evil and tells us how to do things. That was not the original conception there. Christ was there to actually remind us, at least in some of the Gnostic thinkers' conceptions, especially Valentius and some of those, that the conception was more that no, there's that the universe exists in divine pairings. It's not that there's just one. The idea of the demiurge is that there's this one masculine being with his head in the clouds and has no freaking idea of anything else. Interestingly, often connected with time, maybe also has kind of an association with Saturn. But I don't think that's really what Saturn is about, because I feel Saturn has more to do. Saturn may have more of a connection almost to Hades in that way, in the sense that, and you have to remember that Hades and Pluto have a lot to do with treasure and abundance. You know, if you're, you know, what do things grow out of? They grow out of the earth, right? If you value precious gems and gold, where does that come from? Under the earth, right? This is Pluto, Plutos or Plusos. This is Pluto as representing wealth, and there's probably a kind of connection there. This idea of Saturn or Shani as represented to this kind of hidden wealth that's there. That but in order to access it, you know, you have to this takes time. It takes consideration. It takes there's no skipping steps. And the problem with solar mythologies, the potential negatives of them, has to do with the inflation of the ego. Or like, for example, when we talk about the mythology of Rahu, the North Node, Rahu is the one who, Shiva creates a monster to devour him, and then he throws himself on Shiva's mercy, and then he says, okay, I won't do anything. But then the monster ends up eating itself. It becomes this kind of metaphor for kind of life feeding on itself. But Rahu is typically the head without a body. And the whole idea of just the head without the rest of the body to ground you that can be when we have ideas that never manifest themselves. Okay. But I think solar mythologies, the sun sheds puts its light on everything. Okay. So things grow because of the sun. We have light, we have warmth. Daylight makes us feel positive. We think of it very positively associated. But the sun in its extreme, which interestingly often takes on feminine forms, like Sekhmet, for example, can bring drought. It can bring famine. It can burn things up. And when we talk about a kind of solar masculine ideal applied to human society, it can become that totalitarian kind of thing. I had written a story that I have not actually shared. I haven't published it. I know I shared some aspects of this with my Patreon followers, and it was a story I was writing. It was another kind of spin-off story from one that I'm working on right now, because I have different characters. People who read my Morrigan books know that there's the Layla character, and these books have two characters called Aiden and Corinna. Aiden from Aidenus, which is like Hades, and Corinna from Kore. So you see that there's kind of this mythological idea, but again, they're not necessarily meant to. At least one of the stories might be kind of a Hades Persephone recreation, but there was another version of it that I had produced, where it's almost like this figure, this Aiden figure, not the Aiden figure actually. There's another figure who comes in who is almost like the rescuer of Kore, the rescuer of Corinna, right? And he makes the Aiden character look, very dark and almost very evil, although you find out that that's not really quite how this works. But what he does is, when he comes into conflict with this Aiden character, he basically captures and punishes him in such a way that it was so awful that I'm like, I don't even know that I could publish this. It would be very extreme. That was kind of the way it was portrayed, because it was like he was taking all this shadow energy and projecting it onto this one. And it's like, we're going to destroy that thing, because that thing is the problem. That's the scapegoating thing that comes in with solar mythologies. This group of people, or this individual, these people who are on the margins or on the edges, who are not good people. We know what happened during the freaking Holocaust, right? I mean, the way in which the people can be marginalized in the name of something that's supposed to be solar and supposed to be about light and civilization. We can often forget that Apollo, who is the god of civilization and poetry and provides oracles and so forth, is also the god of plague. And brings death and destruction as well as the other. So solar energy, when taken in the wrong direction, or when taken in a direction that is that becomes becomes, soul, S-O-L as in the sun, as in S-O-L-E, the only one, the sole one, becomes, it can become this force that is actually quite harsh, quite restrictive, and quite oppressive. Okay, in the way that the heat of the sun can potentially be oppressive. So it's when that solar energy is taken to its masculine extreme. And the masculine extreme is one that is lacking its feminine, so it's lacking its conscience, it's lacking empathy, it's lacking in a sense of community and nurturing and what's good for the group, because it's only focused on power and on the individual. Now, if we go back to Hindu mythology, many of the Asuras, the so-called demonic figures of Hindu myth, are, and I say so-called because Asuras and Devas all kind of start out at the same place, like they all do spiritual practices and can aspire to things. But Asuras always create an imbalance. They move towards learning siddhis and learning spiritual practices and getting powers so they can amass power for themselves. And we do actually see people in the occult community who try to do this. People who may follow some of these types of these groups that may embrace this aspect of what they consider to be this aspect of Saturn, or this aspect of solar mythology that's reminiscent of what you would see in the Third Reich. And there are a lot of groups out there that are like that. That's what it becomes about. It's about the idea of not necessarily about trying to, I don't know. It's not necessarily about finding enlightenment or finding balance or finding truth, or just experiencing and understanding life as it is. It's about, no, how can I use these things to amass power for myself? And the problem with that is that when you do things in this way, inevitably this will create an imbalance. So if I go back to the Chandipat, which is also known as the Durga Saptashati, which is the 700 verses in praise of goddess Durga. Durga is a Shakti figure, right? And Durga comes in when she's called in, and she's unmanifest. She's actually a form of Devi that is unmanifest. But the gods all pray to her. There's this litany in there that I know I've referred to it before. But she becomes manifest, and she says, "Well, what's she literally manifests a double of herself." And she says, "Okay, well, what's happening here?" And they say, "Oh, well, the Mahisashura, the great ego, the greatly inflated, this is almost like Rahu and solar, and sun energy together. Like it's so inflated, and it thinks it thinks like it's the only one, and it thinks it's the greatest one, and therefore it has oppressed all of the other gods." And is basically just about, it has a massive ego, is just about amassing power for itself. That is the masculine, that is the dark masculine, that is the masculine out of control. So that's why they call upon the feminine deity, the ultimate feminine deity, to come in and battle with this form of masculinity. And she battles in a very dark feminine form. Because the form of Durga, she comes in riding usually a lion or a tiger, depending on which conception. And this great ego king sees her and says, "Oh, I'm going to possess that," because of course he sees the woman as his possession. And so sends this emissary, and the emissary is very funny, because the emissary is just like, "Oh, you have to go to him. He's the greatest. Oh, he's so wonderful. You are nothing, and he is everything." I mean, the way that it's written is just like gross. But what happens is he says, so she sits there and listens, and she says, "Oh yeah, sure. What you say is true. Yeah, he's so great and all this. But being silly me, being a woman, I made this vow that no man is going to possess me unless they do battle with me, unless they take me by force," is basically what she says. And of course, the emissary says, what is wrong with you, you stupid woman? Like, you're never going to win against him. He's the greatest, blah, blah, blah. And she says, yeah, what you say is probably true, but what can I do? I took this vow, so gotta do it, right? And so, of course, he sends his armies out, and they're going to drag her back by her hair, right, to him, and make her submit. And but she recites her mantra, and she blows up the entire first armies that come in. And now you get into this full scale war, and this war is being fought by all female Shaktis. These are all the Shaktis of the Matrikas. These are all the Shaktis of the main devas that we think of in Hinduism. And even when the messenger comes, he's called Shiva Duti. Shiva Duti is it's like this is a messenger that is bringing about the message of you're going to be destroyed. And then this is where, you know, we see Kali manifest, we see Chamunda manifest, and Chamunda is just devouring. She's just grabbing the armies and just shoving them in her mouth, and they just, you know, but she never gains any weight. She just keeps devouring these armies. And then, of course, there's Raktabija, the seed of desire, which is the idea that when you try to destroy something, you just make more of it. That's the boon that he's been granted. So you spill a drop of Raktabija's blood, and it makes like 100 more of him. And this is almost reminiscent of ideas of addiction, or the way that we become attached to things or addicted to things. And so Kali's long tongue comes out, and she just sucks up the blood as they kill him so that he can't reproduce. So she eventually kills the seed of desire, the seed of addiction, of those things which trap us that we can't get out of. So these goddesses all represent the way in which we have clarity, which the way our minds have, you know, made us go after all of the wrong things. I mean, all things that in their place are not bad. They're not evil. So this is not a good evil battle. This is the way in which, when we become too enamored of power and stuff, you know, the way in which we can be derailed into this, because then we do more and more to try to protect our stuff and to control our stuff. It's not, it's, you know, we talk about sovereignty goddesses, but this just isn't just about keeping your land. It's about the way in which power can corrupt, the way in which power says, no matter what the initial ideology is of the society, it becomes, there's going to be the haves and the have-nots. I'm amassing everything for myself, and the rest of you can, you know, can you know, labor under my whip or whatever, you know. And so that's the negative solar mythology. And but a lot of, in that mythology, the negativity gets projected onto another figure. It gets projected onto Lucifer or Satan, who initially, that's not the initial role of Satan. That's why I try to tell people, you know, yes, this is the modern idea we have about, you know, God and Satan and good and evil, but that's not really what it is. And in that sense, the idea of God that we often will see later on can take on this Sol Invictus kind of energy as well. The idea of, you know, I think of God in the book of Job, like, I could squash you like a bug, you know, and all in that one, he's working with Satan, not against him. They've kind of got a bet. So yeah, but there's a lot of projection onto an image. And Carl Jung talks about this in The Answer to Job. He says that to him, Satan is actually the shadow of Yahweh. Okay. And you will see Shani frequently associated with these kinds of figures. Now, I'm not saying Saturn is equivalent to Satan, though you do have people who worship Saturn who kind of, you know, there's some overlap there, right? So, so really that's kind of your scapegoat. That oh, you know, and you do it based on our associations with dark and light. Dark bad, light good. And that's the point I've always been trying to make is, you know, dark is not necessarily bad and light is not necessarily good. Okay. And this is the kind of thing that illustrates that. When we look at Apollo as a deity, Apollo is very arrogant as a deity. He has, I mean, yes, he can produce a lot of these things, but when you see him in his encounters with the feminine in particular, Apollo, he always reminded me, I said, of like those 80s movies, you know, we had you had like the nerds versus the jocks. Like, he always struck me as a jock type. That's the way Apollo's personality seems to come across. And he is one who definitely feels he's owed, you know. And if he wants something, he doesn't matter whether you want it or not, because I want it. I mean, of course, you could say all the male gods and Greek gods are kind of like that to some degree. But I think of the Apollo and Daphne story in particular, where she's a nymph. She doesn't want anything to do with him. She runs from him. He pursues her. She calls out to her father, who was a river god, who changes her into a laurel tree. And then what does he do? He goes over and he starts fondling the tree and taking the laurels off. I mean, so when we think about the baccalaureate, there was something I saw the other day. There was an image of, somebody said, is that an image of a laurel wreath? And I was just thinking, yeah, Apollo and Daphne, like, it went into my head, because the crown of laurels, the laureate, I had no appeal. I was such a jerk before this year, is what Alex is saying. Yeah, I know, the things that you learn. And again, Apollo is one of those gods who, it's not that he didn't probably have his good characteristics, but he definitely has this personality. And it's very interesting that if you look at Apollo's mythology, he has very little success with women. He really does. And maybe not even with men either. I mean, he just doesn't, he's this great solar deity, but because there's the absence of the feminine. I mean, now he does have a twin sister, Artemis, right? And Artemis is a virgin goddess, right? She's not, and she's also a bringer of plague. They're very much, and I've often said that Artemis is kind of the above ground version of Hecate. Like, Hecate is sort of the darker version of Artemis. And again, both Artemis and Hecate are beloved by a lot of people, but Apollo kind of acts in, there's like an absence of the feminine there. He's the one who kills the python that's sacred to Ares. He just goes in and kind of takes what he wants, and he does it in a way. And I always feel like in the Oresteia, in the myth of Orestes, when Orestes is on trial and the Furies have been pursuing him for murdering his mother, and Apollo is standing on the other side trying to say, no, he's not guilty. He did what his duty expected him to do, because Apollo is more about duty and what your proper duty is. And he said, and Apollo makes a statement somewhere in there, in the exact Greek I'm not going to remember, but it's something to the effect of, well, women are not very important anyway. The mother's of no real value. It was kind of the implication of what he says. So, and it's one thing to say, well, he's avenging the murder of his father by his mother and his mother's lover. Although Clytemnestra has her reasons for being pissed off too, because they just felt like, we needed favorable winds, so let's sacrifice our daughter, and let's not tell mom about it. And she makes it even funnier that baby Hermaeus stole his cattle. Yes, the story of Hermaeus with Apollo is a very funny one, because he gets Apollo so angry, but Hermaeus is such a trickster. Eventually, he makes peace with Apollo. They do make friends. And in fact, the first lyre is actually given to Apollo by Hermaeus. There's like this trade, but Hermaeus, or Mercury, asks for certain things for himself too in this exchange. And Zeus thinks the whole thing is hilarious. Like when Apollo comes and brings this baby and goes, this baby stole my cattle, it did that, and Zeus is just sitting there like, just laughing, because that's how delicate the ego is. It's just like, they're the ones who can't take a joke or don't have a sense of humor. Eventually he does come around to that, to be fair to Apollo here, but it is kind of an interesting dynamic. So anyway, I'm kind of gone a little bit all over the place. I started kind of by talking about Surya and Shani to some degree, but to some degree we tend to see Saturn as the dark masculine, but the dark masculine, what we think of as the dark, is really the projection point. Just as the devil would be, or any kind of underworld figure would be. This is why in my book I argue that the feminine becomes the projection point, because, or at least it becomes dismissed or seen as the weaker thing, or more susceptible to, the temptations of hell or whatever, or the temptations of the devil, because there's this association of the feminine with the earth. And we devalue that. We just say, oh, no. And everything that is solar, or that is, part of this conception. And Alistair says, it's all interesting, and I can see the through line, I think. Yeah, it's there. And it's kind of like, again, these are, like anything, these are all aspects of things that, like, to say, I want to accomplish something and I'm going to take steps to do it, to say that, oh, I would like to have, status. I'd like to be the head of my company. I'd like to be, these things are not bad in and of themselves. There's nothing wrong with it. But when this energy is not balanced out by feminine energy. You know, if you have the boss, say, who's just a real jerk and pushes people around just because they can, as opposed to the one who may be more caring. And, you know, if people have situations, saying, well, okay, you know, I can bend the rules a little bit because I understand, showing some compassion to people, right? I mean, think about the difference in how things are approached. I mean, that's a simple example. But when you have somebody who micromanages or who stands over you, it's like, you know, you feel like you're oppressed, and you're just like, I hate that, whatever, and get them away from me. They're terrible at what they're doing. But that's what happens. And the interesting thing is, when we're talking about this on a governmental level, then you are, you know, typically this ironically, this show of strength is actually a sign of weakness. Because one of the points I've also made is that that men embracing that feminine side, and again, embracing your feminine side doesn't mean having to act like a woman. Embracing your feminine side just means having that empathy, having that compassion, trying to think about how things affect the community, acknowledging emotions, and that's hard because men are taught not to do that. Men are taught, like, well, you know, kind of suck it up, and, you know, and women are taught that too, actually. That you know, these things are not good and you shouldn't. But you know, but being able to be comfortable with that, then men also would be more comfortable with women, and they would be more comfortable as they would be more complete human beings. Just as that's why they'll say to women, you need to re-embrace your femininity, because a lot of women have adopted a lot of this ways of thinking and acting because they feel that somehow that's what's really going to allow them to move in this world. So when they say that, it's not, when they say women need to re-embrace femininity, it's not saying, oh, now everybody's got to go home and be barefoot and pregnant or whatever. No, to re-embrace femininity is to say, you know what, I'm not going to adopt, I'm not going to be ruthless. I'm not going to be, I mean, yeah, I can set boundaries and stand up for myself, where if I feel like they're being trampled, just like a man can. But at the same time, you know, there has to be a certain amount of, you know, that empathy and compassion, and recognizing, you know, thinking about how our actions affect other people, because we exist in relationship. That's the key thing that often gets missing when we focus on the individual and me and what I want. You know, we know that the me can lead to extreme narcissism. So again, it's not that this thing is, you know, it's not that if somebody is masculine, that they, or a man, that they're automatically going to be this way. But there tends to be, but in society, we have to look at what we're valuing as our truth standards, and what we're valuing in terms of what it means to be a successful individual in society. And that's the stuff that we need to reevaluate. That's where the feminine needs to come in. And the feminine coming in isn't, oh, everybody go out and start making babies and submitting to their husband. That's not what we mean by the feminine. This is when we talk about the dark feminine. So this dark masculine, dark feminine, like bringing in these elements that have often been demonized, but they're actually the key to having that balance, and to having that abundance, and to having a society that works together. And like I said, I've always felt that the men who are, to me, the strongest are the ones who can embrace and understand that. The ones who can't, and say, no, I have to, everybody's my enemy, and keep away, and, it's going to be my way or the highway. That's a sign of weakness. That is a sign of weakness. And because if you have to do things by force, then that means that you really don't have the power. You have to try to conquer something. You have to try to force it. And this is not, as a general thing, this is not really energetically a good thing for society and for continued human existence at all. So anyway, that's the end of me. And I am going to just wanted to let everybody know. I just got a phone call that came in, so I kind of got distracted there. It's been a little over an hour, and that is actually my sister who was calling. So I guess she's on her way to my house, which is expected. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you found this interesting. If you have any thoughts on it, I mean, certainly the video is going to be posted. Feel free to comment. Feel free to comment on Instagram, wherever you want, Facebook, wherever. I'm always interested to hear what people's thoughts are and what they may have to say. And I really appreciate all of you joining me and listening and your comments. And this is great. So yeah. So everybody, Have a great rest of your Wednesday and rest of your week. And I will see you all next week. And I hope you enjoy the Lewis Attorney podcast. So take care.